So let me
Sorry,
jump in
yes.
there. Let me jump in there and ask some questions that I had after reading the book. And as you unpack the deep, rich historical perspective, some of the questions that come up to my mind are really with the four freedoms themselves, and both Roosevelt's usage of that alliteration almost during his speech, and the idea that some historians say that it was really just a rhetorical device to prepare America for war, but not necessarily something that he wanted to make actionable. So I want you to address that individual critique, but then also where those four freedoms are today in terms of the fight that you feel like we need to reignite for those four freedoms. Take those 2 points and elaborate a
Yeah.
little bit for me.
Yeah, well, I'll start at the grand level and tell you that in the course of for all of the foundations that were laid in the New Deal of the 30s in terms of combating poverty, combating inequality, enabling workers to organize. Oh, by the way, New Deal agencies in the 1930s, although Southern Democrats, who often controlled many of the committees in Congress, although the Southern Democrats wanted to pursue a decidedly segregated New Deal, the Roosevelt administration did not itself, though they often had to defer to that. But if we come forward, I mean, there were all of these accomplishments, both in terms of public efforts and struggles from below to make America freer, more equal, and more democratic in the
Right.
30s. And then the four freedoms are an articulation of that. The most interesting thing is that actually inequality, in part because of the war effort, but also because of specific and deliberate decisions by the Roosevelt administration, actually reduced inequality. So, for example, they actually set wages at a certain level, what we would think of as minimum wages, which enabled working poor, and that was in great numbers, African Americans and Mexican Americans, to actually rise in the standard of income. People ate better, started to live longer. I mean, it was a decidedly progressive moment. The other thing is that Philip Randolph, the great labor leader,
Yeah.
Philip Randolph, the great labor leader,
Hmm.
pursued the desegregation of the war industries, demanded that Roosevelt actually issue an executive order declaring any federal contracted industries that did not desegregate, at least open the door to African American employment, should not be allowed to have those contracts.
Hmm.
And when Roosevelt hedged, he hesitated when Randolph said he was going to bring 10,000 African Americans to march on Washington,
Right.
and Randolph demanded an audience. Roosevelt gave him the audience. Randolph, when asked how many he was going to bring to D.C. as sort of the formality of the occasion, said, "I'm going to bring 100,000." And Roosevelt soon after signed the executive order. Now, what's interesting is we all know that Randolph really brought this pressure to bear, and it was a great moment. I think A. Philip Randolph was one of the greatest labor leaders and civil rights leaders of the 20th century. But the interesting thing is Randolph told people later that he knew Roosevelt was going to do it. He said, "Roosevelt wouldn't have let me in his office if he wasn't prepared to act." And that's critical. There was this sense on the part of this great African-American labor and civil rights leader that he had pressured Roosevelt to bring him in, and he knew that Roosevelt, as his office head, was going to say, "You've made me do it, we'll go ahead and do it." Then,
Right.
moreover, in 1944, if I can go further, sorry, I'm jumping around a bit, but if we go forward in 1944, in spite of the fact that conservative Republicans and Southern white supremacist Democrats did everything they could to block the foremost progressive initiatives, even of the war effort, the fact is that Roosevelt, in his 1944 State of the Union message, went before Congress and the American people and said that it was time, now that we've learned our lessons, it's time for Americans to enact a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights.
Right.
In other words, freedom from want
Hmm.
should become a part of our, if you like, Constitution. And he laid out such things as national health care. He also called for, food, clothing, and shelter as a guarantee, recreation as a guarantee. Now, you could say, well, this is fantasy talk. He's just trying to inspire the war effort. But listen to this. He requested from the White House that the National Opinion Research Commission run polls in 1943 and 1944, asking Americans what they want after the war. What kind of country do they want after the war? And what they discovered in the polling was that 85% of Americans essentially wanted a social democratic United States, including national health care, including the true right to work. That is a guaranteed job, not this right to work of the
Right.
Southern white supremacists of
Yeah.
the day and others, but a real right to work. That is, you were guaranteed a job.
Hmm.
Also, that young people were guaranteed an education, which implied also, by the way, a college education. I mean, there's
Right.
a grand vision that he was looking towards. Found out that's what American wanted, and by the way, that included Republicans. It wasn't just the Democrats they
Right.
asked; they asked all
Well,
Americans.
with
So he
85%.
proposed this second Bill of Rights, 85%. I'm using that as the round number because that's actually the number that wanted a national
Yeah.
guaranteed health care program.
That's astonishing,
I,
astonishing, and as always, you've given me so much more that I can't even really lay an anchor. But I do want to circle back to A. Philip Randolph,
right.
from Jacksonville, Florida, and there's actually a monument here in Boston at Back Bay Station where all this information is public, for public consumption. But I'm a huge fan of.
Sorry, I didn't know that. There's a monument to Randolph?
Yeah, in Back Bay
There's a
Station, in Back Bay
No kidding.
Station
I didn't know that.
right here in downtown Boston. But yeah, so and it's a part of the Amtrak and his work, and for the union for the railroads. So that's a part of
the Pullman car workers. Yeah.
exactly. So it's a part of Jacksonville. I mean, of course, it's American history, but I mentioned that because I'm from Jacksonville, Florida. I spent some years there, and now I'm in Boston. And so when I left, when I jumped on the train and rode the train one time from Boston, from Back Bay Station to Jacksonville, I got off the train, seeing A. Philip Randolph, and got on the train seeing A. Philip Randolph. And but it really speaks to his contribution during his time, not just for that union, but specifically with what you said, the demands that he placed on FDR, and how you're tying all this back into now the actual moves, those physical, tangible steps that FDR took towards the four freedoms,